Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azawi. Today, Iraq is perhaps the most covered story of our times, but are we getting the real facts? When Arab and Western journalists look at Iraq, do they use different lenses and rely on different perspectives, backgrounds, and biases? And perhaps one of the most important questions to be asked, do political agendas of Arab and Western reporters cloud the Iraq story and impact negatively events on the ground? Imran Khan reports.
Two news networks, two very different perspectives. In the highly competitive world of the media, that's nothing new. After all, distinctiveness is key, and it's often your selling point. But in the case of the Iraq War, are we being sold two different things? The invasion of Iraq in 2003 set out a new media battleground. One commentator famously saying that if the last Gulf War in 1991 belonged to CNN, then this war belongs to Al Jazeera. Take this case early on in the war. Arab media broadcast pictures of US prisoners of war. The US was in uproar. How dare you, they cried. It's a violation of rights. Even the then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld weighed in on the act.
What Al Jazeera is doing is vicious, inaccurate, and inexcusable.
The war was being reported in two very different ways. For one analyst, the reason is simple. Arabs wanted to hear of the plight of the Iraqi people. The Americans wanted to hear of victory.
On the American side, we did see a lot of images that focused on the bombing with pinpoint accuracy, that focused a great deal on the advance of American forces and the rapid advances. We did not see a great deal of casualties. We didn't see people who were getting killed. On the other side, you have people here in this part of the world, in the Middle East, who are very much focused on what's happening to the Iraqi people. On Iraqi casualties, on the impact of the war on the population of Iraq.
As the war dragged on, even the US media began to question its role. Had they become the spokesman for the government? One prominent American newspaper, the Washington Post, went so far as to issue an apology, saying it underplayed stories questioning White House claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The paper admitted that their coverage was flawed, and they were not the only ones.
At the time of war, the media, many people, raise the flag and go to war. And that also, there were people who were concerned. They did not want to raise questions about the policies even, because they did not want to be perceived as being disloyal.
They say that truth is the first casualty of war. Well, if that's the case, perspective may also be a casualty. The Arabs say that the Americans are slavishly following their government's agenda. The Americans say that the Arabs are inflaming public opinion. Both sides have learned lessons in covering the Iraq War. However, one wonders what it would have been like had North America been invaded. Imran Khan for Inside Iraq.
To discuss the coverage of Iraq by Arab and Western reporters, I'm delighted to welcome Jihad Al-Khazin, a journalist and a columnist, and Ann Nelson, who teaches at Columbia University in the US, and Jamal Khashoggi, editor-in-chief of the Saudi newspaper Al-Watan. Welcome to all of you. Ann Nelson, let me start with you, but let me preface this episode by saying when we are talking about media, whether it's Western media or Arab media, we're not talking about a monolithic entity. There are shades of blacks and whites, and it runs the whole gamut. Having said that, why do you think that Western media in general and Western and American media in particular lost a great deal of credibility when the issue is Iraq?
I think that it's been an almost impossible story to report well, and part of that is because of the particular situation of the shock and panic in the United States after September 11th. I think it clouded some people's judgment and didn't make them as critical in their reporting as they should have been. But it also came at a time of crisis for the media companies. For example, the US networks were losing audience and were financially precarious. And one thing that happened as soon as the US attacked Afghanistan was that they were really discouraged from reporting on civilian casualties, for example, and advertisers threatened to cancel advertising for networks that reported on civilian casualties. Now, that's a crucial element in reporting any conflict. So we were really, in the United States, hampered from the start.
Is it possible that the Western reporters were sleeping at the wheel on the eve of the war when the drums started to get really louder and louder and everybody knew that war is coming? Western journalists, they could have done a lot better than that they did.
They could have and they should have. And their track record proves that. This is the press that opposed the Vietnam War, the press that uncovered Watergate. I don't know. I hold newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post in absolute high respect, but I think they failed the readers, they failed me in covering the Iraq war.
That begs the question, Jihad, why? Were they unwitting partners or were they willing accomplices with the administration?
I have this doubt in my head and I hope it's wrong. I sometimes feel that they not mishandled the story but ignored it, did not do their best because the targets were Arabs and Muslims. They would have done better if the targeted country was not Iraq. I hope I'm wrong because I really respect those papers.
You are at pain in saying that. You think that there is some sort of a prejudicial aspect to it.
How can you expect their failure otherwise? I mean, I'm open to suggestions. It's just that it is not what I expected from the New York Times and Washington Post in particular, the Los Angeles Times.
Jamal Khashoggi, did the Arab do better on the eve of the war? We will come to the post-invasion.
On the eve of the war, the Arabs were present in Iraq, and gradually they began to withdraw. I mean, 6 months later, probably there was no Arab presence whatsoever when Iraq became dangerous. But the difference between Arab coverage and American coverage, that the Arabs were looking for civilian casualties. They were trying to prove that the Americans are getting it wrong in Iraq. Particularly, we all remember the big story when Al Jazeera reporter was killed in Iraq. That was highly broadcasted throughout the Arab world. So, yeah, the Arab looked at the war differently. They were not looking for success stories. The looting was covered extensively on Arab screens. So actually, I would presume that the Arab media was looking for American mistake.
When two reporters, an Arab and a Western, or even for that matter, in the Western camp, a German, French versus the American, they looked at events. Let's take one. On February 5th, Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, presented the U.S. case for his country about war. And the following day, all newspapers, all magazines, television station, what a great performance, massive, awesome. He sealed the case, he proved it. And the Germans and the French, they looked at what has been presented at the UN. They said, this is it? This is absolutely nothing. This is borders on lies. So how is it possible that two camps, they're looking at the same event and they reach different conclusions?
Well, first of all, I don't think you can generalize about the U.S. media in that respect. But
the big ones like New York Times and the Washington Post, they gave the thumbs up.
Well, the big ones, I mean, I continually go back to point to Newsweek, which did very serious investigative reporting throughout the period leading up to the war and after the war. Very, very critical. There were two problems with the Colin Powell situation in particular. One was that he came into it with not only a great deal of credibility, but with the reputation of being a skeptic.
But also he came reluctantly. He was not sure about the facts.
And so when he came and went forward, people said, well, if he had been a critic of this policy leading into this, it must mean that they have something. Well, they were wrong, but they kept saying there's secret evidence. And it was very hard for the press to prove that there was not secret evidence. So it created kind of a crisis within the journalistic culture in itself.
Among the things, you cast a great deal of doubt about the credibility and the veracity of the information in the possession of the United States government. And that brings us back to what Judith Miller wrote about curveball and the aluminum tubes, and this is solid fact. And here we remember Chalabi and the Iraqi Congress. Was that basically just some sort of a fog? The administration all along saw through it and knew exactly, they had all the information, or were they also a victim of that media?
I think the administration heard what it liked to hear. You know, they wanted to believe what they had. The difference between us and the U.S. administration, we knew the Arab informers, the Arab side who was providing the false information, and for me they were charlatans, three-card sharps, you know, and they had a track record of being, you know, of boarding with the criminal side on the Arab world, so we didn't believe them. With the administration, I doubt that the administration really believed what they said, but they provided the administration what it wanted, the information that would justify the war on Iraq.
Jamal Khashoggi, there was a quote by Colin Powell that sticks in my head about the linkage between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. He was telling that Zarqawi was based in northern Iraq, and that is by itself is evidence that Iraq had linkage to Al-Qaeda. Nobody even questioned that since 92 or 93 perhaps, the no-fly zone in the north falls under the jurisdiction of the Kurds. So Iraq had the writ of the country does not extend beyond Kirkuk.
Colin Powell was building a case for his audience. But in the Arabic press at that time, I remember we were not analyzing the credibility of the United States. We were analyzing whether there will be a war or no war. That was the debate on the Arab media, trying to read between the lines and determine whether there will be a war in the next few days or months or not. And an extensive number of articles were written. Many Arabs were arguing that the Americans are just bluffing. There will not be a war.
Post-invasion, we will talk about that when we come back. Stay with us.
This has been the most shameful era of American media. The media has been sucker punched completely by this administration. Robert Shear, The Los Angeles Times.